Evangeline's finger traced the raw, splintered groove gouged into the window frame, a fresh wound in the old wood that hadn't been there an hour ago. Autumn 1883. The bullet had carved its path through pine and dreams alike, leaving behind splinters that caught the dying afternoon light like tears frozen in amber. "Will the bad men come back, teacher?" Kiona's voice trembled from behind the overturned desk, where she still crouched with her cousins, dark eyes wide with the kind of fear that no 7-year-old should ever have to carry. Dassan stood motionless between the shattered window and Evangeline, his tall frame positioned with deliberate precision to shield them both from whatever fresh violence might come. His buckskin shirt was darkened with trail dust and tension, a single hawk feather woven into his black braid, catching the golden light that filtered through glass, marred by fresh scratches. At 30, the Apache warrior carried himself with the controlled grace of someone who had survived too many battles, his Winchester Model 1873 rifle resting across his shoulders with the casual familiarity of a man who understood that death might arrive without warning. The silence that stretched between them was answer enough. The Stoneheart riders had departed barely minutes ago, their harsh laughter still echoing in memory as hoofbeats faded toward Thunder Mesa's dusty main street. But their message remained burned into the schoolhouse air like the acrid smell of gunpowder. Someone with considerable power wanted this place of learning, destroyed its students scattered, and its teacher driven away or silenced permanently. This marked the third such attack in as many weeks, each incident more brazen and terrifying than the last. What had begun as veiled threats and anonymous warnings had escalated to open intimidation conducted in broad daylight, with armed men firing weapons within sight of children who had committed no crime greater than seeking education. Evangeline's hand trembled slightly as she smoothed her brown hair back into its modest arrangement, trying to project calm authority despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her natural composure. At 25, she possessed an understated beauty that revealed itself in moments of genuine compassion, when her inherent shyness gave way to the passionate dedication that had brought her to this remote corner of New Mexico territory, where civilization hung by threads as thin as spider silk. "The men are gone for now," she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle strength that had made her beloved by every child in Thunder Mesa, regardless of their heritage. "You're safe with me and Dassan. You're always safe here." But even as she spoke the words, Evangeline knew they might be lies. The bullet groove in the window frame represented escalation that could only lead to worse violence. Someone was systematically dismantling everything she had worked to build in this harsh frontier town, using fear as their primary weapon and children as their targets. Dassan's dark eyes met hers across the classroom that smelled of chalk dust and childhood innocence, something passing between them that transcended the cultural boundaries separating their worlds. He had appointed himself guardian of this small sanctuary, where Apache children learned alongside the sons and daughters of white settlers, a radical experiment in cooperation that had earned the institution many powerful enemies throughout the territory. In his steady gaze, she saw both promise and warning. He would protect them with his life. But that protection came with a price that grew steeper with each passing day. The forces arrayed against their small school possessed resources and ruthlessness that might ultimately prove insurmountable, no matter how fierce the courage of those who stood in their path. Thunder Mesa squatted in the harsh landscape of New Mexico territory. Like sun-bleached bones scattered across red earth, its adobe buildings and timber storefronts clustered along a single street that ran parallel to the life-giving, a cottonwood-lined tributary of the Rio Grande. The year was 1883, and the wounds from recent Apache conflicts still festered throughout the region, creating volatile tensions between white settlers and native communities struggling to coexist on increasingly contested land. The town existed at the dangerous intersection of competing interests and old grievances that stretched back generations. Cattle ranchers needed vast expanses of grazing rights for their herds. Miners sought the silver veins rumored to snake through surrounding hills like metallic arteries filled with fortune. The Apache reservation provided a tenuous buffer against hostile bands still fighting territorial authority, but it also represented prime land coveted by settlers hungry for opportunity and prosperity. Evangeline's schoolhouse occupied strategically important ground on the town's eastern edge, built from local pine logs chinked with adobe mud and crowned with a tin roof that caught morning light like a beacon of hope in an often hopeless landscape. The structure was simple but solid, with windows facing east and west to capture the best natural illumination and a stone chimney that served dual purposes of heating the room during brutal winter months and providing a place to prepare simple meals for children who often arrived hungry from homes where food was scarce. What made Thunder Mesa's school unique throughout the entire territory was its radically integrated enrollment. Apache children. Learning side by side with the offspring of white settlers, a bold experiment in cooperation that had earned the institution many powerful enemies among those who profited from maintaining racial divisions and territorial conflicts. The delicate arrangement had been negotiated through months of careful diplomacy between Chief Sani, a dignified Apache leader in his 60s, who understood that education would prove crucial for his people's survival in a rapidly changing world, and Dr. Walter Klein, the town's physician, and one of the few white residents who treated all patients with equal compassion regardless of their heritage or ability to pay for medical services. The territorial government provided Evangeline's modest salary of $2 per week, often paid weeks late due to bureaucratic inefficiency and deliberate neglect, while the Apache families offered protection and assistance in exchange for their children's access to the kind of education that might help them navigate an increasingly complex and hostile world dominated by white customs and laws. But beneath this precarious balance of mutual necessity lurked a far more sinister truth that only a handful of people understood. Recent geological surveys conducted by mining companies seeking new opportunities had suggested that a remarkably rich vein of silver ore extended from the long-abandoned Sable Junction mine eastward toward the town, quite possibly running directly beneath the lot, where Evangeline's schoolhouse stood like an unwitting sentinel over buried treasure. Mining law of the era was complex, but absolutely clear on one crucial point. If a structure were deemed unsafe due to fire, structural damage, or other hazards, and subsequently abandoned by its occupants, the land could be legally claimed for mineral extraction by anyone willing to file proper papers with territorial authorities and pay the associated fees. Leopold Vance understood this legal loophole better than anyone else in Thunder Mesa or the surrounding territory. At 52, the mine owner had spent decades building a network of business interests that allowed him to control most of the town's commerce through his ownership of the General Store Grain Warehouse Freight Company and several smaller mining claims scattered throughout the region. Like pieces on a chessboard, he was determined to win. Soft-bodied but razor-sharp in his business dealings, Vance possessed the calculating nature of a man who viewed human lives as acceptable costs in pursuit of greater profits and territorial dominance. His expensive clothes and imported cigars marked him as someone who had transcended the harsh realities that governed most frontier lives. But his methods for maintaining that position were often brutal in their efficiency. His primary weapon in achieving these goals was Armand Pike, known throughout the territory as Stoneheart, for his well-earned reputation for ruthless violence in service of his employer's interests. Pike commanded a crew of Drifter's former soldiers and wanted men who had found employment in Leopold's various enterprises when legitimate work proved either too scarce or too honest for their particular talents and moral flexibility. These men served as enforcers, debt collectors, and intimidators, operating with the tacit approval and active protection of Marshal Simon Hale. whose badge provided legal cover for activities that would have been considered criminal if performed by ordinary citizens without official sanction. For accuracy, an order was posted under the county seal for a safety inspection requested by the county school board. The marshal only enforced it. Hale epitomized the corruption that plagued many frontier law enforcement officials, a man in his 50s, with a carefully waxed mustache and mirror-bright boots, who maintained order only insofar as it served the financial interests of those who could afford to purchase his cooperation and silence. His definition of peacekeeping involved keeping quiet anyone who might disturb the profitable arrangements that lined his pockets with silver and kept him in power. Among Evangeline's few reliable allies in this hostile environment stood Dr. Walter Klein, a methodical and principled physician in his 40s, who had trained at prestigious medical schools in Philadelphia before seeking his fortune in the territories. His medical oath compelled him to treat patients regardless of their ability to pay or their racial heritage, a practice that had earned him genuine respect among the Apache community, but considerable suspicion from some of the more bigoted white residents. But Klein carried his own burden of guilt from the past. Years earlier, he had served as a cavalry surgeon during the final Apache campaigns, participating in actions that haunted him still. His current dedication to treating Apache patients stemmed partly from remorse over past complicity in their suffering, driving him to risk his reputation and safety in support of Evangeline's integrated school. Another potential supporter was Reginald Boone, a struggling homesteader in his 40s whose nervous stammer and perpetually anxious manner concealed fundamental decency that Leopold Vance had learned to exploit with ruthless efficiency. Reginald owed Leopold substantial sums of money for farming supplies, tools, and equipment necessary for working his marginal homestead debts that kept him essentially enslaved to his creditors' whims and unable to speak out against injustices he witnessed. His 2 young sons, Tommy and Samuel, attended Evangeline's school along with the other children, providing Reginald with powerful incentive to keep the institution functioning despite the growing tensions that threatened to tear the community apart. But his family harbored a darker secret that would soon complicate their situation beyond anything they could imagine. Reginald's wife, Martha, had been secretly feeding Leopold information about town meetings, school supporters, and community sentiment in exchange for temporary relief from their crushing debts. Her betrayal wasn't born of simple greed, but desperate fear. Leopold had discovered her brother's desertion from the army during the recent Apache campaigns, a crime punishable by execution if reported to military authorities. The shame and legal consequences would destroy not only her brother, but her entire family standing in their tightly knit community, where reputation meant the difference between survival and ostracism. Every morning, without fail, Dawson appeared at the river ford with Kiona and her cousins, escorting them safely through the 2 miles of rough country that lay between the reservation and the school. This duty had been assigned to him by Chief Sani, serving both as protection for vulnerable children and as a gesture of goodwill toward the white community that might help prevent the conflicts that had plagued other territories throughout the Southwest. At 30 years old, Dawson moved through the world with the controlled efficiency of someone who had survived battles, betrayals, and losses that would have broken men of lesser character and determination. His Winchester Model 1873 rifle bore the patina of meticulous care and maintenance, its walnut stock worn smooth by countless hands, its mechanism cleaned and oiled, with the religious devotion of someone who understood that his life might depend on its reliability at any moment. He spoke English with complete fluency, but chose his words with the same precision he applied to reading animal tracks or selecting the proper ammunition for different types of threats. What he hadn't anticipated when accepting this responsibility was how the shy schoolteacher's unwavering dedication to all children, Apache and white alike, would gradually penetrate the defensive barriers he had built around his heart through years of loss and disappointment. The source of his caution lay buried in tragedy. during the final cavalry campaigns against Apache bands still resisting territorial authority. Dasan had lost his wife and young son to an attack on their winter camp. The wound had never fully healed, leaving him reluctant to form new attachments that might result in fresh grief. But watching Evangeline's gentle courage with the children stirred feelings he had thought buried forever alongside his family in the high country where their spirits rested. Now, as he stood guard over this small sanctuary of learning, Dasan found himself fighting two battles simultaneously, one against external enemies who threatened the school's existence, and another against his own growing feelings for the woman who had made protecting these children the center of his world. The evening that would change everything began when Evangeline returned to the schoolhouse to retrieve the arithmetic primers she had forgotten in her haste to get the children safely home after the afternoon's terrifying intimidation. The building stood silent and seemingly peaceful in the gathering dusk, its windows reflecting the last golden rays of sunlight that painted the surrounding desert in shades of copper and gold. She pushed open the front door, noting absently that the iron strap hinges hand-forged were beginning to show their age and would need replacement before the harsh winter storms arrived to test every weakness in their small fortress of education. The familiar space greeted her with its comforting mixture of chalk dust, pine sap, and the lingering traces of childhood innocence that made her work worthwhile, despite its many challenges and growing dangers. Moonlight filtering through the western windows provided just enough illumination for her to navigate between the student desks toward her teaching table at the front of the room. It was only when she reached for the forgotten books that she noticed the back door standing slightly ajar. Its sturdy frame splintered along the edge where the iron latch had been forced by someone with considerable strength and malicious intent. The sight sent ice through her veins as she realized that someone had violated her sanctuary, breaking into the safe space she had worked so hard to create for students who had few other refugees from the territory's endemic violence and prejudice. Moving cautiously toward the damaged entrance, Evangeline struck a match and held it high, its flickering light revealing the full extent of the violation that had taken place. Desk drawers had been yanked open, and their contents scattered across the floor in deliberate destruction. Books lay torn and trampled their pages, destroyed by boots that had shown no respect for the knowledge they contained. Her carefully maintained supplies of chalk paper and pencils had been swept from their shelves and ground underfoot in a display of pure, malicious vandalism. But what she discovered near the coal scuttle transformed her fear into paralyzing terror that threatened to overwhelm her ability to think clearly and rationally. A bundle of dynamite sticks lay partially concealed beneath a black iron container, their waxy surfaces gleaming dully in the matchlight, like instruments of death waiting to fulfill their deadly purpose. Hemp twine bound the explosives together with professional competence that spoke of military or mining experience, and a length of mining fuse. Number 6 safety fuse, 90-second per yard burn, extended from the bundle toward the center of the room, where fresh scorch marks on the wooden floorboards told the story of an interrupted ignition attempt. Only some unforeseen circumstance, perhaps her earlier return to collect materials or the arrival of an unexpected visitor, had prevented the saboteur from completing this deadly work that would have reduced the schoolhouse to splinters and ash, likely killing anyone who happened to be inside when the explosion occurred. The paper wrapper around each dynamite stick bore a distinctive stamp that made her blood run cold with recognition. Sable Junction Mining Company, high-grade nitroglycerin. The fuse appeared to be standard mining issue, the kind used in legitimate blasting operations throughout the territory, confirming that this wasn't the work of random vandals, but rather a calculated act of destruction planned by someone with access to commercial explosives and professional expertise. Before she could fully process the terrifying implications of her discovery, the sound of familiar footsteps approached across the schoolyard with the measured cadence of someone who moved carefully through dangerous territory. Dasan had been maintaining his usual evening vigil in the cottonwood grove, watching for threats that might materialize under cover of darkness when his charges were most vulnerable to attack. "What is it?" he asked quietly when he saw her pale face and trembling hands, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from years of dealing with crisis situations where panic could prove fatal. "Dynamite," she gasped, pointing toward the concealed explosives with a hand that shook despite her efforts to maintain composure. "Someone tried to destroy the building. They would have killed any children who were here." Dasan studied the evidence with the methodical attention he might give to reading animal sign on a hunting trail, building a mental picture of what had transpired based on the physical clues left behind by whoever had committed this act of terrorism. He examined the binding twine, the condition of the fuse, and the scorch patterns on the floor. With the same careful precision he applied to tracking wounded game through difficult terrain. "Mine fuse," he confirmed after several minutes of silent observation, his voice flat with the certainty that came from hard-won experience with explosives and their uses. "Sable junction paper. They want it to look like an accident stove explosion, careless teacher handling coal, no more school to complicate their plans." The cold logic of the scheme sent chills through Evangeline as she realized that her death would have been not just an acceptable outcome, but quite possibly a desired one that would eliminate any possibility of contradictory testimony or unwelcome questions from territorial authorities who might investigate the school's destruction. "Then we have to prove who really did this." She said, her voice steadier than she felt, as her natural courage began to assert itself over her initial terror and confusion. Dasan nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both agreement and respect for her determination to fight back against those who threatened innocent children. He carefully lifted one of the dynamite sticks with his neckerchief, wrapping it securely before sliding it into his leather haversack, where it would serve as crucial evidence when the time came to confront their enemies in a court of law. "Evidence," he said simply, his single word carrying the weight of a solemn promise that justice would eventually be served, no matter how powerful or ruthless their opponents might prove to be. Their whispered conference was suddenly interrupted by shouting voices and the ominous orange glow of flames visible through the windows, coming from the direction of Reginald Boone's homestead, several hundred yards to the south. They ran toward the disturbance, their feet slipping on loose gravel, as the smell of burning hay began to drift across the desert on the evening breeze, carrying with it the promise of fresh violence and escalating terror. They arrived at Reginald's modest farm to find his precious haystack blazing like a giant torch, the flames reaching toward the star-filled sky and casting dancing shadows across the yard where Stoneheart riders wheeled their horses in tight circles of intimidation. The men were firing shots into the air and whooping like celebrating cowboys. But this was no celebration. It was pure terrorism designed to break the will of anyone who might consider supporting the school or its mission of integrated education. Reginald himself crouched behind his water trough, clutching a bucket in hands that shook with a mixture of fear and desperate determination as he tried to douse the flames that were consuming his winter feed supply. A bullet from one of the riders' pistols knocked his hat clean off his head, missing his skull by mere inches and sending him sprawling face first into the dirt of his own yard. The raiders departed as suddenly as they had arrived, with their harsh laughter echoing across the prairie as they spurred their mounts toward town, leaving behind only the acrid smell of gunpowder and the crackling sound of burning hay. In the sudden silence that followed their departure, Reginald slowly picked himself up from the ground, his face pale with shock and his clothes covered with the dust of his own humiliation. He staggered toward Evangeline's small house, stumbling occasionally, as the full impact of what had just occurred began to sink into his consciousness, like poison spreading through his veins. When he reached her porch, he collapsed onto the wooden steps, his breath coming in short gasps as he struggled to form coherent words through his characteristic stammer that had grown worse under the stress of constant fear. Said, "I gotta testify." He whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant crackling of his burning hay. "Said the Indians destroyed your school with their own hands. Said if I don't sign their paper, my note comes due at dawn. Said they'll take my boys away from me if I can't pay what I owe." The words hit Evangeline like physical blows as she realized the full scope of the trap that was closing around them like the jaws of some mechanical predator. Leopold Vance was systematically eliminating every potential source of support for the school using economic leverage and outright threats of violence to force good people into cooperation with his schemes of theft and territorial domination. But there was something else in Reginald's manner that caught her attention. Nervous glances toward his homestead, a tremor in his voice when he mentioned his wife's name, a hesitation that suggested complications he wasn't revealing. "Martha's been acting strange lately?" He stammered his words, coming in broken fragments. "Always asking about town meetings, who supports the school. I thought she was just worried about our situation. But now I'm wondering." The implication hung in the air between them like smoke from the burning hay, heavy with the suggestion of betrayal from an unexpected source. Before Evangeline could respond to this troubling revelation, Dasan stepped forward from the shadows, where he had been maintaining vigilant watch for additional threats. "You will not sign their lies," the Apache warrior said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made contradiction seem impossible. "We'll give them something else to fear before this business is finished." The words were spoken softly, but Evangeline heard in them an iron determination that suggested the situation was about to escalate, far beyond mere harassment and intimidation. She felt a chill of both gratitude and apprehension, understanding that her quiet life as a frontier schoolteacher was about to become something far more dangerous and unpredictable than anything she had ever experienced or imagined possible. Dawn brought Leopold Vance's next calculated move in his campaign to seize control of the valuable school property. Evangeline arrived at the schoolhouse to find an official legal notice nailed to her door, with a heavy iron spike, its territorial seal still wet with morning dew, and its formal language designed to intimidate anyone who might question its authority or legitimacy. The document, signed by Marshal Simon Hale in his characteristically flowing script, declared the building officially closed, pending a thorough safety review by qualified territorial inspectors due to credible reports of structural instability and serious fire hazards that pose an immediate danger to the welfare of minor children. The language was carefully crafted to sound entirely legitimate and reasonable to casual observers. But Evangeline recognized it for what it truly was, another move in Leopold's carefully orchestrated campaign to seize control of the land beneath the schoolhouse through legal manipulation and bureaucratic corruption. She ripped the notice from the door with such violent force that the iron nail remained embedded in the wood, her usually gentle demeanor completely overwhelmed by protective fury for her students' welfare and future. Within an hour of her defiant gesture, Marshal Hale arrived at the school accompanied by 2 of his deputies, both men whose loyalty could be reliably purchased for the price of a bottle of whiskey and a few silver coins. Hale's mirror-bright boots gleamed in the morning sunlight as he approached, his mustache freshly waxed and his badge polished to a high shine, the carefully maintained appearance of legitimate authority masking a thoroughly corrupt character beneath the surface. "Miss Hart," he said with elaborate false politeness, tipping his hat in a mockery of gentlemanly behavior that fooled absolutely no one present. "I'm afraid you're in direct violation of a lawful order issued by proper territorial authority. Removing that notice constitutes willful destruction of official government property, which is a serious criminal offense under territorial law. "This is my classroom," Evangeline replied with remarkable steadiness, despite the tremor in her hands that betrayed her inner tension and growing fear. These children need their education now more than ever. You have absolutely no right to close a properly functioning school based on anonymous complaints from people who refuse to identify themselves or provide evidence. Hale's expression hardened perceptibly, revealing the crude bully that lurked beneath his carefully maintained veneer of civilized behavior and official respectability. He gestured curtly to his deputies, who moved to flank Evangeline with the practiced ease of men thoroughly accustomed to intimidating defenseless civilians who lacked the power or connections to fight back effectively. Before they could lay hands on her, the sound of running feet interrupted the tense confrontation that was building toward potential violence. Kiona came racing across the schoolyard from the direction of the river ford, her small legs carrying her as fast as they could manage, while her voice rang out clear and strong in the morning air with desperate urgency. "Dasan," she called out in her high crystalline voice. "They're trying to hurt Teacher. Come quickly." The Apache warrior seemed to materialize from the cottonwood grove with startling suddenness, emerging from concealment like a spirit given physical form. He walked toward the confrontation with measured deliberation, his hands remaining visible and empty, his rifle slung across his back, in a clearly non-threatening position. Yet something in his bearing, the controlled grace of his movements, the steady intensity of his gaze, caused both deputies to instinctively step backward despite their numerical advantage and official authority. "You can lock me up instead," Dasan told Hale with quiet confidence that seemed to fill the entire schoolyard with its calm certainty. "If she walks away, free and unharmed." Hale's eyes darted nervously between the Apache warrior and the growing crowd of townspeople who had been drawn by the commotion and were beginning to gather around the edges of the confrontation. Several mothers had arrived to deliver their children to school for the day, and their expressions ranged from confused concern to openly hostile disapproval as they witnessed their local marshal attempting to arrest the woman who taught their children to read and write. "Jail's not sized for hospitality, friend." Hale sneered, trying desperately to maintain his authority in front of the audience that was rapidly growing larger and more restive with each passing moment. "You might find the accommodations considerably less comfortable than you're expecting." Dasan took another deliberate step closer, and Evangeline saw the subtle but unmistakable transformation that came over him. His usual calm watchfulness shifting into something far more dangerous and predatory, like a mountain cat preparing to strike at prey that had wandered too close to its den. "You certain about that assessment?" Dasan asked his question, carrying implications that made both deputies reach instinctively for their pistols, while their eyes searched desperately for the best available escape routes. The crowd murmured uneasily, sensing the potential for serious bloodshed that hung in the air, like the electrical charge that preceded a violent thunderstorm. Mrs. Caro, the stableman's wife, stepped forward with her 6-year-old daughter clutching desperately at her skirts for protection and reassurance. "Marshal Hale," she said in a voice that carried clearly across the entire yard, cutting through the tension like a blade. "What exactly are you planning to arrest Miss Hart for teaching our children their letters and numbers, helping them learn to read the Bible and understand their responsibilities as citizens? For willful destruction of official territorial property?" Hale replied, but his voice had lost much of its earlier conviction as he realized that the mood of the crowd was shifting decisively against him and his abuse of authority. Dr. Klein arrived at that critical moment, carrying his medical bag and wearing the expression of a man profoundly irritated by bureaucratic nonsense that interfered with more important work of healing and helping people. "This is complete foolishness, Marshal." Miss Hart provides the only educational opportunity available to our children within 50 miles of this location. If you arrest her, you'll have to explain to every parent in this town why their children can no longer learn to read and write. Caught between Leopold Vance's explicit expectations and the growing opposition of the very people he was supposed to serve and protect, Hale found himself searching desperately for a face-saving compromise that would allow him to maintain some semblance of authority. While avoiding an outright confrontation, he was not entirely certain he could win against a united community. Finally, seeking to appear reasonable while still serving his true master's interests, he made an offer designed to seem fair while remaining impossible to fulfill under normal circumstances. Fine. The teacher can go home for now and continue her activities elsewhere. But the warrior pays a $20 bond, a peace bond, under territorial practice by sundown. Or I arrest them both for interfering with official territorial business. $20 represented more money than most people in Thunder Mesa saw in an entire month of honest, backbreaking labor. For someone like Dasan, who lived largely outside the cash economy of the white settlement and had little need for coined money in his daily survival, the sum might as well have been $200 or $2,000, equally impossible to obtain through legitimate means. The demand was clearly designed to be impossible to meet under any reasonable circumstances, ensuring that both Evangeline and her protector would end up in Hale's jail by evening, where they could be dealt with quietly and permanently without further interference from concerned townspeople or territorial authorities who might ask inconvenient questions. In the tense silence that followed this ultimatum, Evangeline watched Dasan's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly as he calculated options and considered possibilities with the methodical precision of the experienced tactician. She could see him preparing to make whatever sacrifice might be necessary to ensure her continued freedom and safety, regardless of the personal cost to himself. Use my teaching wages, she offered quietly, even though she knew perfectly well that her modest salary would barely cover half the demanded amount, even if the territorial government had actually paid her on time for once in their professional relationship. No, Dasan said, with a firmness that indicated the matter was not open for discussion or negotiation under any circumstances. Instead, he began systematically removing the silver conchos from his leather belt, traditional Apache ornaments that had been crafted by skilled artisans and passed down through several generations of his family like precious heirlooms carrying the weight of history and cultural identity. Each piece represented not just significant monetary value, but irreplaceable cultural heritage, personal history, and spiritual significance that no white man could truly understand or appreciate. One by one, he let the precious silver discs clink into Marshall Hale's outstretched palm, trading away irreplaceable pieces of his identity and his people's legacy to purchase the freedom of a woman he had sworn to protect. The sound of metal striking metal seemed unnaturally loud. In the morning stillness, each concho representing a small piece of his soul, offered up for Evangeline's safety and continued ability to serve the children who depended on her guidance. The crowd watched in increasingly uncomfortable silence, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something profound and deeply moving. A gesture of sacrifice that transcended cultural boundaries and spoke to fundamental human decency in a way that shamed them all for their previous inaction and passive acceptance of injustice. When the last concho had been transferred to Hale's greedy hands, the marshal counted the pieces with obvious satisfaction, his avarice momentarily overcoming his political calculations and revealing his true character to everyone present. "Bond accepted," he announced with poorly concealed smugness. "But this school stays closed until I personally determine that it's safe for children to enter the premises." As the marshal and his deputies departed with their ill-gotten payment, the gathered parents began to disperse with worried murmurs about their children's education and their community's increasingly uncertain future. Dr. Klein paused to speak quietly with Evangeline, assuring her that he would begin making discreet inquiries about the true forces behind these increasingly brazen harassment tactics. But it was Dason's gesture of sacrifice that remained uppermost in Evangeline's thoughts as she walked slowly back to her small house, her mind reeling from the morning's events and their implications for everything she had worked to build in Thunder Mesa. Outside the jail, when the crowd had thinned and they found themselves relatively alone, she had insisted on tending to a scrape on his knuckles where his hand had struck the rough door frame during the tense confrontation with Hale's deputies. The moment had been charged with unspoken emotion as she bandaged the minor wound with strips torn from her petticoat, and their faces close enough that she could feel his breath against her cheek, could see the flecks of gold that lightened his dark eyes, could sense the carefully controlled strength that resided in his weathered hands. "You didn't have to sacrifice so much," she had murmured, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had given up for her sake, and struggling to find adequate words to express her gratitude and growing feelings. "I know exactly what I was doing," he had replied with characteristic simplicity and directness. "I chose to do it anyway." Those words continued to echo in her mind as she contemplated the escalating danger they all faced and wondered what Leopold Vance and his associates would attempt next when they realized that simple intimidation was not going to achieve their goals of driving her away and seizing control of the school property. Despite Marshal Hale's official closure order, Evangeline made the deliberate decision to reopen the school the following morning, understanding that this act of defiance would almost certainly provoke escalated retaliation. But feeling that her commitment to the children's education outweighed considerations of personal safety or legal consequences, she unlocked the repaired door at dawn and began preparing lessons for the day ahead, while Dasan took up his customary position in the cottonwood grove, maintaining vigilant watch over all the approaches to the building with the disciplined attention of a professional soldier who understood that the enemy might strike from any direction without warning. The children arrived in small groups as the sun climbed higher in the desert sky, their parents having made quiet decisions during the night that their youngsters' education was worth the risk of official displeasure and potential retaliation from powerful forces that seemed determined to close the school permanently. Kiona led her cousins from the reservation, walking hand in hand with Tommy and Samuel Boone, while the Klein and Caro children followed close behind their mixed group, representing exactly the kind of cooperation and mutual understanding that certain interests were determined to prevent at any cost. The first serious attempt to stop them came at the river ford, where the AA cottonwood-lined tributary of the Rio Grande could normally be safely crossed during periods of reasonable weather and moderate water flow. Evangeline had decided to personally accompany the children to the shallow crossing point, partly to ensure their safety during the potentially dangerous journey, and partly to demonstrate publicly that she would not be intimidated by threats, legal harassment, or acts of violence directed against her or her students. Dawson walked with them, maintaining his usual position, slightly ahead, and to one side of the group, his Winchester Model 1873 rifle carried with the casual readiness of someone who expected trouble, but hoped to avoid it if circumstances permitted. The morning was crisp and clear, with the kind of crystalline air that made the distant mountains seem close enough to touch, with an outstretched hand creating the illusion of peace and safety that would soon prove to be tragically false. Birds called from the riverside willows, and the gentle murmur of flowing water created a peaceful natural soundtrack that made the sudden sharp crack of rifle fire all the more shocking and terrifying for the children who had never experienced the reality of combat or deliberate attempts at murder. The first shot struck the water barely a foot from where Kiona was preparing to step onto the submerged stones that formed the traditional crossing path used by generations of Apache families and friendly travelers. The bullet's impact sent up a geyser of muddy spray that soaked the child's dress and caused her to stumble backward with a cry of alarm and confusion that pierced Evangeline's heart like a physical wound. "Down, everyone, down." Dasan commanded his voice, cutting through the morning calm with absolute and unquestionable authority, born of battlefield experience. Evangeline reacted with the swift efficiency that months of teaching frontier children had developed in her natural protective instincts, immediately pushing the nearest students behind the natural shelter provided by a large boulder that had tumbled down from the cliff face decades earlier during some long-forgotten rock slide. Her schoolteacher's protective instincts took complete control as she quickly counted heads and assessed injuries, ensuring that all of her precious charges were properly protected and accounted for in the chaos of the moment. More shots rang out from the willow thickets on the far side of the ford, the bullets striking water and stone with deadly precision that was clearly intended to terrorize rather than kill outright. The shooters were obviously skilled marksmen who could have easily hit their targets if immediate murder had been their primary goal. But they were sending a different and more sinister kind of message: cooperate with our demands, or next time the shots will be aimed to kill rather than merely frighten innocent children. Dasan had absolutely no intention of allowing the ambush to continue unchallenged or unpunished. Using the churning water and morning mist rising from the river's surface to mask his movements, he rolled sideways into the swift current, allowing the flow to carry him downstream toward a position where he could flank the concealed gunman who had made the fatal error of threatening children under his protection. Evangeline watched with a mixture of admiration and stark terror as the Apache warrior moved through the water with the fluid grace of a man born to such environments and trained by necessity to use every natural advantage in his struggle for survival. He seemed to become part of the river itself, using every rock formation and patch of shadow to conceal his approach from the men who had dared to turn a place of learning into a battlefield, where innocent lives hung in the balance. The confrontation that followed was brief, but decisively violent in its outcome. Dasan emerged from the concealing willows behind the first shooter like an avenging spirit of the wilderness, his powerful hands closing around the man's rifle barrel with crushing force and wrenching the weapon away before delivering a clubbing blow with the wooden stock that sent the would-be assassin unconscious into the mud at the river's edge. The second gunman, suddenly realizing that his carefully planned ambush had been turned against him by someone far more skilled in the arts of warfare, attempted to flee through the thick brush that lined the riverbank. But Dasan was already moving with the relentless efficiency of a hunting wolf, his long legs carrying him in pursuit through terrain that he knew far better than his prey could possibly imagine. The sound of crashing vegetation and a single sharp cry of pain marked the abrupt end of the chase, leaving Evangeline to deal with the immediate aftermath of terror as she worked to comfort frightened children and assess the practical problems created by the failed attack on their small group. Little Maria Santos had fallen into the shallow water during the initial confusion and was now shivering uncontrollably with cold and shock, her lips turning an alarming shade of blue despite the morning's relative warmth. The child's condition was potentially dangerous if not addressed immediately and decisively, particularly in an environment where medical care was limited, and winter diseases could prove fatal to the young and vulnerable. Without a moment's hesitation, Evangeline pulled the frightened girl against her chest, wrapping her own woolen shawl around the small body, and using her natural body heat to ward off the life-threatening chill that could lead to serious illness or even death in the harsh frontier environment where weakness was often synonymous with mortality. "Stay close to me, sweetheart," she whispered in a voice that remained steady and reassuring despite her own racing heart and the adrenaline that coursed through her veins like liquid fire. "Breathe with me now. Count to 10 like we do in arithmetic class. Everything is going to be perfectly all right." When Dasan returned from his successful pursuit, dragging an unconscious second attacker behind him through the mud and scattered debris of the riverbank, his dark gaze immediately focused on Evangeline's protective stance as she ministered to the traumatized child with a natural compassion that defined her character. There was something in his expression as he watched her natural courage and goodness in action, a recognition of her fundamental strength and moral fiber that seemed to strike him with unexpected emotional force. "You're hurt?" he observed, with characteristic directness, noting the way she slightly favored her left shoulder, where she had wrenched it while diving to shield the children from the initial gunfire. "It's nothing serious," she replied automatically, though the pain was sharp enough to bring involuntary tears to her eyes, and would likely worsen significantly over the coming days, if not properly treated. Their eyes met across the small space that separated them, and for a moment, the dangerous circumstances seemed to fade into irrelevance compared to the emotional current that flowed between them. What passed between them was deeper and more significant than mere words could express, a recognition of shared values, mutual respect that transcended cultural boundaries, and the growing realization that they functioned as an extraordinarily effective team when facing adversity together. That evening brought the second major escalation in Leopold Vance's increasingly desperate campaign of intimidation and harassment. Dr. Klein had volunteered to make discreet inquiries about the source of the attacks on the school, using his position as the town's physician to gain access to information and conversations that might otherwise remain hidden from public scrutiny or official investigation. His investigation led him to the back rooms of the Turkey Feather Saloon, where Leopold Vance conducted much of his unofficial business away from the prying eyes of territorial authorities who might ask uncomfortable questions about his methods and motivations. But Klein brought his own burden to this dangerous reconnaissance, guilt over his past service as a cavalry surgeon during the Apache campaigns, when he had participated in actions that haunted him still, and drove his current dedication to treating Apache patients as penance for old sins. Hidden behind a partially open door that provided an excellent vantage point while keeping them concealed from view, Klein and Dassan observed a meeting that revealed the true scope and ultimate objectives of the conspiracy they were facing. Leopold sat at a scarred wooden table that had seen decades of hard-use, expensive Cuban cigars filling the air with aromatic smoke that couldn't quite mask the underlying odors of stale beer and unwashed bodies that permeated the establishment like a permanent stench of moral corruption. Across from him, Marshal Hale leaned forward with the eager attention of a man discussing highly profitable business arrangements that would benefit all parties involved in the conspiracy. Between them on the table lay an open ledger filled with columns of figures and dates, along with a distinctive tobacco tin embossed with the Sable Junction Mining Company logo that both observers recognized immediately from their previous discoveries. "Keep that school closed for at least 2 more weeks," Leopold instructed in a voice that carried the casual authority of someone thoroughly accustomed to having his orders followed without question or delay. "Armand and his boys will handle the more permanent aspects of our little problem during that time, and will be able to move forward with the next phase of operations. Doctor?" Klein quickly sketched the visible page of the ledger with the artist's eye for precise detail that his medical training had given him, noting the regular payments recorded to someone identified only by the initials S.H., clearly referring to Simon Hale, along with dates that corresponded exactly to various incidents of harassment and intimidation that had occurred throughout the territory over the past several months. The tobacco tin proved equally revealing when examined more closely, its distinctive label matching exactly the wrapper they had found on the dynamite planted in the schoolhouse, establishing an unbreakable direct connection between Leopold's mining operation and the attempted destruction of the school building. But the most disturbing revelation came when Leopold began outlining his plans for what he euphemistically referred to as the final solution to our Apache problem. A scheme that involved not just closing the school, but creating a completely fabricated incident that would provide justification for the forced military removal of the entire reservation population from the territory. thereby opening vast tracts of valuable land for mining development and white settlement. The fabricated raid would serve multiple purposes in Leopold's grand design for territorial domination. It would eliminate the Apache children from the school, removing one significant source of opposition to its closure. It would provide legal justification for seizing reservation lands that might also contain valuable mineral deposits. Most importantly, it would create a climate of fear and hatred that would make the white population grateful for Leopold's protective presence and willing to support his expansion throughout the region. The third and most dangerous attempt to eliminate organized opposition to Leopold's plans came during Evangeline's ride to warn Reginald Boone not to sign any false testimony that might be used against the school or its supporters in some future legal proceeding. She had borrowed a reliable mare from Dr. Klein's stable, reasoning that she could reach the Boone homestead and return to town safely before darkness fell, and made travel significantly more hazardous for a woman alone in hostile territory. Her assessment of the risks involved proved to be tragically and nearly fatally incorrect. Armand Pike and 3 of his most trusted Stoneheart riders intercepted her on Sorrow Hill, a stretch of particularly treacherous terrain where the trail wound between towering red rock formations that provided perfect concealment for a carefully planned ambush. The attack came without any warning whatsoever, armed riders emerging simultaneously from multiple concealed positions to surround her with weapons drawn and ready for immediate use if she showed any sign of resistance. "Easy now, schoolmarm," Armand called out in a voice that mixed mock politeness with unmistakable menace and barely controlled violence. "We just want to have ourselves a civilized conversation about your future prospects in Thunder Mesa and the surrounding territory." But Pike's demeanor was different from his previous encounters. There was reluctance in his actions, doubt in his voice, that suggested internal conflict about the increasingly extreme nature of Leopold's orders. The man who had built his reputation on ruthless efficiency was beginning to question whether he had signed on to commit atrocities rather than simply enforce business interests. The mare beneath Evangeline began to dance, nervously sensing the danger that surrounded them, and responding to the tension she could feel radiating from her rider's body like heat from a forge. Evangeline was an adequate horsewoman for normal circumstances, but she was hardly skilled enough to handle a panicking animal while surrounded by armed men mounted on superior horses and clearly prepared for violence. "Whatever you're planning won't work in the long run," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her ability to think clearly and rationally. "People know where I've gone and when I was expected to return. If something happens to me, there will be questions that you won't be able to answer satisfactorily." "Nothing unfortunate is going to happen to you, ma'am," Armand interrupted with a laugh that contained no humor whatsoever, though his heart clearly wasn't in the threat as it had been in previous encounters. "Not if you prove to be reasonable about your situation. All you need to do is pack up your books and teaching materials, find yourself another town to plague with your high-minded ideas about Indian education, and leave Thunder Mesa permanently before the week is out." The tense conversation was suddenly interrupted by the sound of rapidly approaching hoofbeats, a single rider moving fast across the broken terrain with the confidence of someone who knew every rock gully and hidden path in the region, like the lines on his own hand. Dasan appeared on the ridge above them, mounted on his lean bay gelding that moved with a sure-footedness that marked it as a horse-bred and trained in mountain country, where a single misstep could mean death. He had been following sign throughout the afternoon, tracking the hoofprints and disturbed vegetation that marked the passage of armed men, moving with clearly hostile intent towards someone he was sworn to protect above all other considerations. The sight of the Apache warriors silhouetted against the sky seemed to unnerve Pike's men considerably more than they cared to admit even to themselves. Stories of Dasan's skill in individual combat had circulated throughout the territory for years, growing with each telling until he had achieved an almost legendary reputation among both his allies and his enemies. "Ride away from here, Apache," Armand called out with forced bravado, trying desperately to maintain his authority and control over the situation, despite the obvious concern that had crept into his voice. "This business doesn't concern you or your people directly." "It concerns me," Dasan replied with characteristic simplicity, his words carrying across the distance between them with quiet finality that left no room for negotiation or compromise. What followed was a desperate chase across some of the most treacherous and unforgiving terrain in the entire territory. A running battle that tested every skill both sides possessed. Pike's men opened fire with their rifles, their bullets sparking off the red sandstone formations as Evangeline's borrowed mare lost her footing on the loose shale that covered the steep hillside and pitched forward violently, throwing her rider hard against the unforgiving rocky ground. Agony exploded through Evangeline's left shoulder as she struck the stone with crushing force, the impact tearing muscles and sending waves of excruciating pain through her entire arm and upper body. For several long moments, she lay stunned and gasping for breath, certain that Pike's men would reach her position before she could regain her feet and find adequate cover from their weapons. Instead, she found herself swept up in a powerful arm as Dasan's bay gelding thundered past her position, at full gallop the Apache warrior leaning low in his saddle to scoop her up with the casual ease of someone retrieving a dropped hat from the ground. The maneuver required perfect timing, extraordinary horsemanship, and absolute confidence in his mount's ability to maintain balance, while carrying double weight, all executed flawlessly, while bullets whined through the air around them, like angry hornets seeking blood. For more than half a mile, they rode together across the broken landscape. Evangeline pressed sideways across Dasan's saddle, with her uninjured cheek against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and the controlled power of his breathing as he guided his mount through the maze of stone formations that would eventually provide them with adequate shelter from their pursuers. Only when they had reached complete safety did she realize that his voice had developed a slight tremor as he murmured, "I thought I'd lost you forever." The words revealed a depth of emotion that neither of them had previously acknowledged, openly expressing a fear that went far beyond his sworn duty to protect the children and their teacher. Pressed against him with the sounds of pursuit finally fading into the distance behind them, Evangeline came to understand that something fundamental and irreversible had changed between them. What had begun as a practical partnership formed for the children's safety had evolved into something far more personal, infinitely more dangerous, and potentially more precious than anything either of them had previously experienced in their difficult lives. The question that remained was whether they would survive the coming confrontation long enough to explore what that transformation might mean for their future together. The midnight break-in at Marshal Hale's office required careful planning, considerable risk, and a level of coordination that tested both their courage and their growing trust in each other's capabilities under extreme pressure. Dr. Klein had provided the crucial intelligence earlier that day during his treatment of a miner's broken wrist to the injured man made careless by pain. And excessive whiskey consumption had muttered complaints about blasting powder being signed out directly to the marshal rather than going to the mine sites where it was legitimately needed for excavation work. This revelation had prompted Evangeline and Dasan to take desperate action that could easily result in their arrest, imprisonment, or worse, if they were discovered by authorities who had already demonstrated their willingness to use violence against anyone who threatened their profitable arrangements. If they could find concrete documentary evidence linking Hale directly to the sabotage attempts, they might be able to expose the entire conspiracy before it escalated to outright mass violence against the school children. The marshal's office occupied the ground floor of Thunder Mesa's combination courthouse and jail. A squat adobe building that squatted on the main street like a malevolent toad contemplating its next meal. Two small windows flanked the heavy wooden door, and a single oil lamp burned continuously in the front window, casting flickering shadows that provided both opportunity and considerable danger for anyone attempting unauthorized entry into official premises. They approached the target from the alley behind the building, moving through the deepest shadows, with the careful silence that Dasan had mastered during years of hunting and warfare, in terrain where a single careless sound could mean the difference between life and death. The rear window proved to be their point of entry. After several tense minutes of careful work with Dasan's knife blade, the corroded latch finally yielding to patient manipulation. Inside the cramped office, they found themselves surrounded by the evidence of Hale's corruption documents scattered carelessly across his desk, wanted posters featuring the faces of men who had mysteriously avoided capture, and personal correspondence that revealed the casual nature of his criminal associations throughout the territory. But it was the contents of the locked drawer that provided the smoking gun they desperately needed. Along with the distinctive Sable Junction tobacco tin that connected him directly to the school bombing attempt, they discovered a hand-drawn survey map that revealed the true scope of the conspiracy against not just the school, but the entire Apache population of the region. The map showed detailed plans for a fabricated raid that would provide justification for military intervention against the reservation, complete with locations where false evidence would be planted, and witnesses would be positioned to provide perjured testimony about Apache aggression that had never actually occurred. "They mean to destroy your entire people," Evangeline whispered as the full horror of the scheme became clear to her. The magnitude of the planned genocide overwhelming her ability to process the sheer evil of what they were contemplating. As they prepared to leave with their crucial evidence, the sound of approaching footsteps on the wooden boardwalk outside froze them both in place, like deer caught in a hunter's spotlight. Marshal Hale was returning to his office much earlier than his established pattern suggested, clearly intoxicated, but still dangerous and fully capable of violence if he discovered intruders in his private domain. The confrontation that followed was brief but extraordinarily savage in its intensity. Hale's attempt to kill them both was thwarted only by Evangeline's quick thinking and Dasan's superior fighting skills, but not before the corrupt lawman managed to inflict a serious knife wound that would soon threaten Dasan's life through infection and fever. Working by lamplight, with hands that shook from adrenaline and fear, Evangeline stitched the gash closed with the careful precision she had learned from watching Dr. Klein treat injuries, all while knowing that discovery could mean death for both of them. The intimacy of the moment, his trust in her inexperienced hands, her determination to save the man who had risked everything for her safety, marked a turning point in their relationship that neither would ever forget. Leopold Vance's most desperate and final gambit began at dawn with a plan so ruthlessly comprehensive that it revealed the true depths of his moral corruption and willingness to commit mass murder for financial gain. Having failed to close the school through legal intimidation, economic pressure, and direct violence, he had decided to employ what military strategists referred to as scorched earth tactics if he couldn't gain control of the school and its valuable property. Through other means, he would destroy it completely, along with anyone who might survive to testify about his previous crimes. But this fire would be unlike any the territory had ever seen. Leopold had spent weeks transforming the schoolhouse into a sophisticated death trap, with oil-soaked kindling placed throughout the walls, iron bars secretly installed behind normal-looking shutters, and the floor systematically weakened to ensure that anyone inside would be trapped when the structure collapsed into the basement. The plan called for Kiona to serve as bait. The child's innocent return to retrieve her beloved primer would ensure that Evangeline and Dasan entered the burning building where they would all perish together, while Leopold positioned himself as the heroic rescuer who arrived too late to save them from Apache sabotage. But Leopold had underestimated the community's growing resistance to his tyranny. Martha Boone's guilty conscience had finally overcome her fear of exposure, leading her to confess her role as Leopold's spy and provide crucial intelligence about the planned massacre. Her testimony revealed not only the school fire plot, but also the fabricated raid designed to eliminate Apache leadership throughout the territory. Reginald Boone, freed from the economic slavery that had forced his cooperation, joined the growing coalition of decent citizens who were finally ready to stand up against Leopold's reign of terror. Even Armand Pike, disturbed by the escalating violence and Leopold's willingness to sacrifice his own men, began to waver in his loyalty to an employer who clearly viewed everyone as expendable. The fire itself exceeded Leopold's most optimistic projections for destruction and terror. The schoolhouse became a roaring furnace within minutes, its prepared combustibles turning the entire structure into a death trap that seemed inescapable. When Dasan entered the inferno to rescue Kiona, the building began collapsing around them, forcing him to navigate a maze of falling beams and spreading flames, while carrying a terrified child through smoke thick enough to kill. Evangeline's desperate vigil outside the burning building, watching the man she loved risk his life for an innocent child, crystallized her understanding of what they meant to each other. This wasn't just partnership or mutual attraction. It was love forged in the crucible of shared values and tested by the ultimate sacrifice. The escape through the sabotaged river crossing became a harrowing test of trust and determination. With all three of them linked together by Dasan's rifle sling in a desperate gamble that they would all survive or all perish together. The current had been deliberately altered to create deadly rapids, where none had existed before turning their natural escape route into another weapon in Leopold's arsenal of death. But it was in the abandoned mine that the final confrontation reached its climax, as Pike's crisis of conscience led to his betrayal of Leopold and the exposure of the full scope of the conspiracy. The underground battle became a fight for survival, not just against human enemies, but against the mine itself, as weakened supports collapsed and poisonous gases threatened to kill everyone trapped in the tunnels. Dr. Klein's arrival with community reinforcements marked the beginning of the end for Leopold's empire of corruption. His detailed medical records, combined with Martha Boone's testimony and the physical evidence recovered from various crime scenes, provided an unbreakable case that no court could ignore or dismiss. Leopold's final flight to the railway station became a pathetic end to his grandiose ambitions, his carpetbag full of stolen documents spilling across the platform like confessions written in his own hand. The man who had terrorized Thunder Mesa for years was reduced to a whimpering coward begging for mercy from the very people he had tried to destroy. The rebuilding of Thunder Mesa began immediately, but it represented far more than mere physical reconstruction. The community had been transformed by their shared ordeal, united in ways that transcended the racial and cultural divisions that had previously separated them into hostile camps. The new schoolhouse that rose on the same foundation was built with contributions from every family in Thunder Mesa, both Apache and white, representing the kind of cooperation that Leopold had tried to prevent. Chief Sani's participation in the dedication ceremony marked a new chapter in relations between the communities, while the land grant that placed the school in permanent trust ensured that no future Leopold Vance could threaten its existence. But perhaps the most important transformation was in the relationship between Evangeline and Dasan, two people who had found love in the most unlikely circumstances and proven that different worlds could indeed come together when guided by shared values and mutual respect. Their quiet partnership, forged in battle and tempered by sacrifice, represented hope for a future where cooperation might triumph over hatred and greed. On the evening of the school's reopening, as they walked together along the riverbank where they had once fled for their lives, Evangeline finally understood what they had built together. It wasn't just romance or even partnership. It was a foundation strong enough to support whatever challenges the future might bring to their small corner of an often hostile world. Standing in the doorway of the school they had fought so hard to preserve, watching Kiona race toward the river with her classmates listening to children's laughter that represented hope incarnate, they knew they had achieved something precious beyond measure. They had created a place where love could flourish, where different peoples could learn from each other, and where justice could triumph over even the most ruthless opposition. The shy schoolteacher had smiled at the little girl, never knowing the Apache warrior had fallen for her. But what they built together transcended simple attraction. They had forged a bond capable of withstanding any storm, and strong enough to nurture the dreams of generations yet to come.